Good afternoon. I would like to welcome all the participants of today's event. Firstly, I would like to express gratitude to the State Affairs Department and personally to Mr. Pavlo Krivonos, the Director General, for the organizational support for this event. I would like to present the participants of this roundtable and to say the aim of our today's meeting. The war is ongoing for almost one and a half year, and every day the civilians of our state, our military, our children, their families are killed and divided. And today we will talk about the outcomes of this war, namely about the involvement of the minors in warfare contrary to international law, the involvement of young people, and involvement of the Russian youth to warfare, and the engagement of Russian youth about the warfare and military action, about the war crimes committed against the children in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, about the forcible deportation and the ban on the self-identification as Ukrainians. As you know, well, when we think about all those things, we could track the strategy of our enemy. Firstly, they have militarized the Russian youth. Then they invaded our country and started to militarize Ukrainian children. They started the so-called special military operation, which led to the killings, to the rapings, to the injuries of children. They started to abduct Ukrainian children, which recalls of the Ottoman Empire and the events that happened 500 or 600 years ago, if you look back at history. About the events of the invasion of fascist Germany and the abduction of children. And there is enough room for many analogies, but I would like to present today's speakers. Firstly, it is the head of the Regional Center for Human Rights, the expert at the Regional Center for Human Rights public organization, Kateryna Rashevska, and she will speak about the schemes, the methods of the forcible deportation of Ukrainian children, about the types of victims, the main strategies of Russification of Ukrainian children in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and the foster care of Ukrainian children in the Russian Federation. The second speaker is Mariia Panchenko, president of the European Youth Parliament Ukraine non-profit organization. She will talk about the influence of Russian propaganda on Ukrainian youth, the so-called brainwashing of Ukrainian youth. The third speaker is Yulia Himyryk, is a representative of Slitstvo-Info and author of different reports on the abduction, on the deportation of Ukrainian children. And the Slitstvo-Info analyzed a lot of issues and prepared a lot of reports about how the enemy used Ukrainian children as part of this warfare. Next, Yulian Lubin, director and founder of the I'm Ukrainian project. He will talk about the influence of Ukrainians in the disclosure of Russian crimes. And Serhiy Chernyshuk, the medical director of the Ahmadit Children's Hospital, and he will talk about the medical aspects, the war impact on children, the outcomes and also about how the aggressor uses the healthcare system and medical facilities to abduct Ukrainian children and transfer them. And about a lot of other things. I would like to briefly cover the issue of militarization. According to our data, the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, different regions, Russia started to militarize children in 2015 after the first invasion, and according to Putin's decree in 2015, the Russian educational movement was created, which is aimed at creating different cadet military classes for youth. And all of the Russian school children were involved, as well as the Ukrainian children on the occupied territories of Ukraine, which are almost more than 4 million of people. Ukrainian parents and more than 275,000 of Ukrainian teachers. And this movement involved children from older than 8 years old. And all the schools of the Russian Federation and temporarily occupied territories, there will be new class called the grounds of security and the defense of the state, and all the children involved in this class, even though who weren't involved in the Young Army and other military movements, all those children would be militarized via the school programs, school classes. There are also the special supervisors in those schools who have to supervise the teaching of those classes in the specific manner. And according to Putin's decree, when in 2022 there was created a special group of the on the development of the network of different centers for military upbringing, which is aimed at the preparation of children for using firearms. And Serhiy Kiriyenko, Putin's representative, also announced the new program Knowledge, which is aimed at the preparation of trainers for those centers. And this program would include also the ideological aspects. And the trainers would be the athletes of martial sports, and also those people who were involved in the special military operations. Therefore, those people who committed crimes and killed people in Ukraine, who were involved in the warfare. And I would like to say some words about the Young Army, created in 2016 by the initiative of the Defense Minister of Russia, Shoigu. And its objective is also to prepare children to military service, and also the ideological aspects. Those people are gaining skills in different parts of different battles, for example, street battles and so on. And this organization, Young Army, involves a lot of children from different ages, and recently it also includes people from the kindergarten, and there are very many pictures and videos about and that presented that children from the kindergarten are also taught how to use different arms, and also wearing military clothes. and also there are a lot of military youth clubs. For example, Wagneronok, which is called after Wagner military group. And people in those Wagneronok clubs are taught to control drones, and they are also undergoing the preparation to later become a part of the Wagner military group. And with the support of the Ministry of Education of the Russian Federation, there was a contest there called Big Change, which included the presentation of distorted Russian soldiers for people older than the 5th class graders. And that contest is for over 2.5 million children and thousands of teachers and schools in Russia. Those who were school children in the Soviet Union and could recall the events from there, the so-called agitational propaganda brigades and the propaganda in schools. As you can see, people from the first rows can understand me, as I also studied in Soviet school, and of course we were brainwashed that only the Soviet Union was strong, powerful, and children's brain are washed to understand that the main task is to defend the country from enemies. And today's aim of those contests is, for example, that the enemies are Ukraine, NATO, and so on, Western countries. And recently I also read some research that the child's brain, the brain of child, which is surrounded by the adults, by adults who these children rely on, and it is very hard to change the viewpoint of this child, which is brainwashed, and this brainwashing of children is a serious poison with very severe consequences. And almost 1.5 million of Ukrainian children are now in the territory of the Russian Federation and temporarily occupied the territories of Ukraine since 2014. And we can see the reason why all those military programs are created, and how Russians try to change the minds of Ukrainian youth. And the consequence of such strategy is that thousands of Ukrainians that were just children some years ago in the territorially occupied territories of Ukraine are now at the war against Ukraine. Keeping in mind that unfortunately, the Russian Federation did everything possible to aim the minds of its youth against Ukraine. There are also a lot of military clubs, movements, and organizations who are created to upbringing the Russian citizens with the high morale, so-called high morale, which is actually the upbringing of people who are tranquil and who are obedient to the rules to the governing regime. And for last 9 years, the Russian Federation propagates the war among its youth and so on. The Russian youth is involved in different events, exhibitions about military. They are involved in voluntary projects and also undergoing military preparation. And it is not only the official data, but also the evidence. It is evidenced by the words of Ukrainian children who were transferred from the occupied territories of Ukraine to the Russian Federation, but returned to Ukraine. And they are saying that it is the truth that Ukrainian children have to, for example, create the special equipment for Russian soldiers and, for example, write letters of gratitude for Russian soldiers, and it is obligatory. And Ukrainian children are forced to write the letters of gratitude to Russian soldiers who are actually killing our citizens today. On the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, the militarization of children is built upon the military propaganda aimed at the preparation children to military service in the armed forces of Russia, and such it is created in different schools in Crimea, in Donetsk and Luhansk regions and other occupied regions of Ukraine. Since the start of the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation, the involvement of young Ukrainian youth to the young army of Russia is taking place in the Kherson region, in Melitopol, and other newly occupied territories of Ukraine. As we can see, since the full-scale invasion, Russia immediately brings newly published handbooks to start the education of Ukrainian children in the occupied territories, including the militarization, the process of militarization. Also, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, 200 teenagers were taken to Chechnya, as evidenced in different social networks, posts. Ukrainian children were brought to Chechnya for educational reasons, as also reported by Maria Belova and Ramzan Kadyrov in their Telegram channels. And there were also TV reports that those 200 Ukrainian children would be involved in the military preparation and would be brought for future military service. Deputy head of presidential administration Sergei Kriyenko announced the special grant for the military education of children in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. The governor of Sevastopol, Mikhail Rozvazhayev, also said that the Russian soldiers involved in this special military operation should also be a part of the educational process, as children rely on them. There's a lot of information, but I would also like to outline some things. Since 2022, as I mentioned, the obligatory involvement of young people to the young army of Russia, which is recalling Hitler Jugend, when the fascist Germany created different kids groups for military purpose, to propaganda war system. and many people who were part of the young army are now the combatants in the special military operation, and people in 17 or 17, 18-year-old could be combatants, part of the occupying forces. And there is also a law which included that the minors, people who are under 18-year-old, who were committing crimes, could be taken to the also military purposes, and those people who are part of the juvenile jurisdiction, who were committing crimes and has to bear responsibilities, they could also be involved in the military operation of Russia. And also a lot of children who were taken from occupied territories of Ukraine and then were returned to Ukraine, they also report that they were brought to military lyceums, military schools, for preparation for military actions. And people, children, who were objecting this, those children had to bear so-called responsibility, but still be involved in different military patriotic events, and many young boys of 17, 18-year-old were suggested to study in different military universities and military colleges. So we can summarize that Russia has a clear strategy developed even before the first invasion, and after the first invasion in 2014, and many children were involved in military clubs, and nowadays this strategy has already been implemented and became widespread. And it is also became part of Russian legislation, as every child in Russia, as every child in Russia would be forcibly involved in the activities of military clubs, and their brains will be aimed against Ukraine. And I would like to give the floor to Ms. Kateryna Rashevska about the issues I mentioned before.
Thank you for giving the floor. In the program, it was pointed out that I have to describe the general scheme of deportations, and before that, I'd like to address you with particular steps how we shall contradict this deportation of children and the consequences it has, because according to estimates, together with deportation, there are more than 14 articles of conventions are violated. So therefore we can understand how full-scale these violations are and what consequences they have, in particular on the international stage. Going back to the deportations, yes, actually, as Mykola Kuleba said, this is a clear strategy, and I'd like to say for myself that it's a clear policy, and the role in this policy belongs to those persons who pledged their loyalty to the President Putin, and if we want to call them name by name, we can just open a list of his entrusted persons on the 2018 elections and understand that one of those persons is people responsible for children's rights. Another representative was a president representative who adopted laws on the simplification of process of passportization of Ukrainian children, and another representative is a vice speaker of State Duma of Russian Federation, and she was state responsible for children's rights. But somehow we're talking about only Mariia Panchenko, like the actions of other people do not raise concerns. We're not talking about deportations. There are also questions how many deported people there are, and we say that this number varies from 4,000 children and to 700,000 children. This number is said by the Russian officials, and they can't explain this huge gap. And recently they have added that this number covers children starting from the 2014. But before they said that this information was concerning the information from the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And we actually can see that we can trust Russia. Russians have a couple of schemes how they deport children. First of all, it was an evacuation, but during an evacuation, international law has to be observed, and lex specialis in particular this case. But we can see and understand that Russian Federation is not observing nor Article 69 of the Geneva Convention. We don't have cards for the children which are then maybe transferred to the International Red Cross Committee. These actions are not agreed with Ukraine. The children are deported to Russian Federation or to third countries, to Belarus, for example, and this is contrary to international law, because children can only be transferred within the borders of belligerents. And we don't know as well that we know that Russia hasn't been making any humanitarian corridors which are safe, and this wasn't actually an evacuation. And when they blew up the Kakhovka dam, they demonstrated that there were no evacuation during the last 6 months, and when evacuation was due to be done, they were thinking for a very long time. Then they said that evacuation is not needed, then it became needed, and they evacuated only 500 children. When we are talking about thousands of children which should have been evacuated because they were drowned in water. And we shall also emphasize that children are deported to Russian Federation from the territories closer to Ukraine, and both to Sakhalin, for example, evacuation to where we cannot explain. In 19 regions of Russia, children have been given into care taken by Russians. In the report of one of governors, particularly in the report of Governor of Rostov people, we can see 1,400 people given into the care taken in that oblast. And in accordance with Russian law, the caretaking can only be legalized on Russian Federation citizen and people who come to Ukraine with their children, to Russia with their children, cannot do this. For example, if a child comes with his grandmother from Ukraine, this grandmother cannot be his official caretaker person. And in such oblasts there were no shelters for children, and children appear to be in Russian families. We don't know particular number of children, and we don't know particular number of children taken into Russian families. And the secret of this process doesn't allow us to know it exactly. And when Russian court has been making a report on this process, and we can't actually know. Mariia Belova says that she won't give any further information because, like she says, Ukrainian side will not be silent. And I have continuously been given recommendations upon this, but unfortunately they are too general, and I'd like to present here particular diplomatic baby steps, which are small steps and particular ones, and I will talk about each particular step by describing it in detail. We need monitoring. It is not efficient to say to profile international organizations that Russia doesn't give access to information and to the children. Therefore, international organizations have to make an announcement, resolutions, so that Russia must provide information and stop its actions. For example, the Eugenia Gamba, special representative for children rights in armed conflicts, and she says that deportations of Ukrainian children aren't in her responsibilities, and we have thousands of cases of abductions of children, of Ukrainian children, because the aim of those deportations is actually has the same aim as the abduction, and such deportation throws them into informational vacuum, into low vacuum, but this low vacuum is prohibited, in particular to the minors, and those who monitors this, they have to distribute this function of identification of shelters for these children, conditions in which they are kept, and names of those children. Then we need sanctions, and not sanctions like freezing accounts of those people on which territory, and also the broadening of menu of sanctions. For example, prohibition to enter other states, because it is very bad that, for example, people can go to the country which has sanctions on them, and the entry to the country has to be prohibited. Then, for example, why person responsible for human rights of Crimea still isn't in any sanction list. And for example, she have been orders for adoption of Ukrainian children to Russian families since 2014, and this is actually war crime. And then we have to talk about the issue of responsibility, because the issuance of warrant by International Criminal Court is very good, of course, but more persons have to be evicted and included into this list. And there have to be done reclassification of those orders. And the final thing is recompensation. Mykola Kuleba knows that when they are returning children to Ukraine, it actually happens to the occupied territories or to the families which have lost their homes, and of course those families need financial help and they need rehabilitation. This all needs a lot of funds. And for example, talking about sanctions, money of Russian officials are freezed. They're just laying without usage, and for example we could have used them for the help, to provide help to Ukrainian children. Maybe my speech is kind of cynical, or for example to make someone guilty. Actually no, I just wanted to demonstrate that in your hands there is a mechanism by which you can affect the Russian Federation and its policy concerning forcible deportations and transfer of children, and so that our children can have happy childhoods here in their motherland. And I believe that you can do it, and to bring these thoughts to your governments, and then we'll have such decisions on international level about which I have mentioned. Thank you, Ms. Kateryna.
And we once again started speaking about important issues about the estimate of children who became victims of deportation. We can only do some assumptions. We can use the reports of returned children as evidence. We know how this takes place. If we are talking about the abduction, about the forcing of children to do something, about banning of return, about banning the saving operations, they do everything to prevent the taking back of children. They use force and they coerce, because we take part. We are involved in. We are witnessing this every day. And Putin and other Russian officials publicly announced that they are saving children, but I always use one simple example. Just imagine that someone came into your house, killed your wife, kidnapped you, abducted you, and put your house in fire, but at the same time your enemies who were living that house, they would heard the cry of children, and they returned to take the child back. And now they are saying that we should close our eyes on this all the crimes, but to keep in mind focus only on the fact that they saved the child, that the child could not survive, but Russians are saying that we should ignore all the crimes, but focus on the fact that they save that child. And it is the most important part. But still, this example is presenting the actions of Russia. Russia tries to focus our attention, international attention, on the fact that they transfer the child, and it is a survival. It is for child survival. But at the same time, the objective of this transfer is to devastate the Ukrainian identity, and we have to keep in mind all those data, all those things to understand Russia's actions. Therefore, the words of Ms. Kateryna addressing to the leading international organizations, the words of Ms. Kateryna are very important, because without the help of international organizations, it will be hard for us to identify those children, to identify the crimes, to identify the fact that they were forcibly deported. And we should keep in mind that according to official estimates, that almost 4,500 children are orphans, and the state Ukraine is the guardian of those children, and we are requesting for the information about those children, and those children have to be returned to their families. And those children just vanished into thin air after the invasion, after they were transferred to the territory of the Russian Federation. It is impossible to find facts about those children. And during our last save operation, 5 children, 5 orphans were rescued. And as the witnesses say, that the Russians in military form came to the homes of those orphans and required to go with them. 2 more children were educated in the special orphanage, and we managed to bring them back to Ukraine. And also, children are forced to have Russian identification documents and Russian citizenship. It is evidenced by words of returned children. And the main sentence by Russians is that the children are forced to go with Russians and have Russian citizenship, because they would be just forcibly deported. And according to last decrees, last laws, the children also forced to have Russian citizenship, because otherwise they would be just foreigners on the occupied territories of Ukraine if they have Ukrainian citizenship. And today we are talking about the acts of genocide of Ukrainian children who are located on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And Save Ukraine Charitable Fund have rescued 125 children who were abducted and forcibly deported, and we managed to rescue and to return them to Ukraine, and they are all witnesses of Russian military crimes, war crimes. And it is very complicated. It is very complicated today, because if before for example, the grandmother of the abducted child could come come to Russia and just present the documents and take the child with her. But nowadays, that grandmother has to do the DNA test to prove that they are relatives. And all those acts are. All those crimes are the violations of humanitarian law and also the violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and I would like to publicly call upon the International Committee of the Red Cross to create the initiative group to cooperate with Russian side, not just to condemn the Russian actions, but to create the special group and to work together, work with Russian Federation, and to point out the obligations of the Russian Federation as a part of conflict, which is also the member of the United Nations, to point out its obligations and to report the list of deported children, especially if the Russian Federation emphasizes that it is just evacuation. The mandate of the Red Cross allows to request the members to work according to under the international laws. Otherwise, the Red Cross could report the problematic issues to the UN Secretary General, and according to international principles, we all know those principles, but we also call the Red Cross to become a part of, to become a mediator between Ukraine and Russia, and the Red Cross should ensure that Ukrainian children in Russia are alive, they are kept in fine conditions, and we call upon the International Committee of the Red Cross to become a mediator to inform us whether those children are still alive and what is happening with them. How many of them are eager to come back to Ukraine? We know that they are tortured and they are under fear. They are living under fear. An important issue we are talking about, that they are brainwashed every day. They are forced to antagonize their country, and I would like to give the floor to our next speakers. Ms. Mariia Panchenko, President of the European Youth Parliament Ukraine non-profit organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mykola. Thank you, Ms. Kateryna, for your report. And this topic is actually very important. And from my side, I'd like to address the issue of European countries, of accepting of European countries, the civil society in Russia, and how the communication is done between different youth representatives as a head of European Youth Parliament. And shortly about my organization, we are part of a network of civil organizations in Europe throughout 36 national committees, and unfortunately one of the committees is European Russian Parliament of Russia. Repeatedly with its events and European Youth Parliaments have been meeting challenges that we have to unite for peace, for democratic values, because different principles prescribed in the statute of the European Youth Parliament and it's a general statute and its statutes of its national committees, which are transferability, democratic values. We are working on the principles of democratic elections, which have to be done annually, involvement of the youth into informal education, and how civil society has to work in the modern world. And unfortunately, it often happens that Europeans do not understand how we work on the territory of Ukraine and how society in Russia works. And before the full-scale invasion, we had a meeting in Turkey. It was an international forum where all national committees were represented, and therefore there were representatives from Russian Federation. It was 2 weeks before the full-scale invasion in 2022. And speaking frankly, me as one of the representatives of Ukrainian European Youth Parliament, I was afraid, and this fear was well grounded because, for example, representatives of Russian Youth Parliament, he is part of some force structures in Russia, and he takes part in military competitions. And before the start of full-scale invasion, some national committees have said that they fully support Ukraine, and even Russian European Youth Parliament, after the 4 days of full-scale invasion, publicated a post where they said that they support peace in the whole world, and they are not part of this political fights. And I'd like that this European Youth Parliament is not a religious, not political organization. This is a kind of youth organization which are conducting informal education through modeling of the work of European parliaments in the committees by working and discussing different topics which are currently important. Unfortunately, Europeans have not understood it at once, and they tried to conciliate European Youth Parliaments of Russia with Ukraine's, which were very concerned with the fact that this organization still has access to all contacts and to personal information of participants of all events, in particular the participants and members of the Ukrainian European Youth Parliament. And now if we are talking about the deportation of children from the temporarily occupied territories, we shall not forget about the fact how this happens actually. And one of such risks is access to personal information, which is placed on different youth networks. If we address the reaction and why this topic is actually important and why we should talk about this, because, for example, before, in a couple of days before the full-scale invasion, we received a letter from our Baltic friends, which wrote that they will talk to different institutions in the European Union in order to give protection for members of the European Youth Parliament from Ukraine, because there is a huge risk of that our participants, and I remind you that this is a youth organization, participants of which are people from 20 to 15 years, and there are as well older people up to 35 years, which take active part in the life of civil society, which are interested in democratic values, and that Ukraine has access to all the good things of European world. And we received information that our participants are in the short list of Putin, that our participants could have been shot. Unfortunately, we cannot check this information, but such reports from our friends make us think about how safe actually is participation of our members in forums, both international and both in Ukraine. And if we are talking about our organization, we have not only participants from Kyiv and not occupied territories. We also have participants from recently occupied territories such as Kupiansk and Enerhodar of Zaporizhzhia Oblast, and these participants have a particular civil position, and if they then go to the occupied territories, or they appear to be under occupation, and these children have a bigger chance to be aim and the target for Russian forces. When we are discussing these topics with international office, which is located in Berlin and which coordinates the whole network of European Youth Parliaments, we faced the fact that Europeans do not understand that this threat is real, because for them the main goal is that they can find good Russians who can help us to restore Russian civil society. Of course, civil society as a fact is important, and we can entertain hopes that this will become a reality. But currently, we're having other conditions, and if we are talking about access to personal information, we should be very careful with that. Recently, Russia was Russia exited Council of Europe, and we look at the network of European Youth Parliaments. Those were countries members of Council of Europe. If Russia is not a member of Council of Europe, therefore Russia cannot belong to a network of European Youth Parliaments. But in March of 2023, at the meeting of presidents of all national committees, there was a decision in order to take changes to the Charter of the European Youth Parliament, and in particular to include Russia as a special country which has the right to take part in meetings of European Youth Parliament. And here we come to the most interesting part of this story. Why did this actually happen? All decisions are taken through voting procedure, and at this session almost all participants were present. Of course, there were no Russians, and there were some more countries absent, but there were for about 35 national committees. In favor, there were 17 countries, and 17 countries of Council of Europe want that Russia still has access to personal information of all participants of the European Youth Parliament, and that Russia can take part in events of this. Of course, who were against this is Ukraine, Poland, Georgia, and when we grounded our position that we are countries who are victims of Russian aggression in one or another way, we faced an answer that they cannot listen to us because we are talking emotionally. Participants are young. For example, if we go back to the National Committee of Georgia, and if we will talk about the occupation of Georgian territory, which is still going on from 2008, and we will understand that participants of European Youth Parliament of Georgia live almost all their lives with the fact that their country is as well occupied by Russian Federation. And as Ukraine, we talk to the European Youth Parliament as a country which has its territories occupied for 9 years, that we are in danger and we can't hold meetings in safety. There is a danger for Ukrainian citizens who take part in meetings abroad, for that they cannot be caught or got information about their location. We received an answer that we are too emotional, and that the question of civil society has to be active the whole time and has to be regarded as well on the territory of Ukraine. And now, when we are talking about the abduction of children, it is very important to understand how exactly our partners and European neighbors have to support us. Because if we are talking about the deportation, if we are talking about access to personal information, in this case, the key factor is how we perceive society in Russia, how we perceive things, what are happening at the territory of Russia, and what is the danger for our children present at the territory of Ukraine and can found themselves in occupied territories, and both children which are already deported to Russia and as well as children who take part in events abroad and in the territories of other states who are also accepting Russian refugees, values of whose we cannot know. And we can actually talk that civil society in Russia is absent and it can't help us. But at the territory of European Union, we don't have such mechanisms, and we have constantly worked on this in order to develop mechanisms for help of those who were victims of Russian actions and to prevent more victims of Russian aggression, which is not only can be conducted through missile attacks, but also through informational influence of propaganda, and as well, when we are talking about the events, also about the influence on the values of Ukrainian youth. Thank you for your attention, and I give the floor to
Thank you very much, Ms. Panchenko. You know, you shouldn't be concerned about Putin's list as the whole of Ukraine is enlisted there. Since 2014, I am a part of sanctions list in Russia because I am involved in the children's rights in Ukraine, and it is the issue of concern for Putin because he believes that only he is capable to save Ukrainian children. Now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Yulia Hemarik, representative of SLIS 24, about your research. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mykola Kuleba. At the end of 2022, I started a research about the abduction of Ukrainian children. And firstly, it should be the research about the abduction of Ukrainian citizens and the people who are responsible for this abduction. But during my research, I found out the information about two young girls who were transferred but couldn't be returned back. And since then, our research became the rescue operation, actually. Those two children and other 5 children who were rescued by Save Ukraine became witnesses of the atrocities. They became witnesses of in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and it was important for me not to become the part of propaganda, for example, because we all know that the world is looking at us, but they do not believe it. The world does not believe the actual atrocities, and I decided to present facts and emotionless present the information that Russians are abducting, torturing, and killing Ukrainian children. It is not just legends. It is a reality of people who are living on the occupied territories of Ukraine. Those two girls told about the tortures against Ukrainian children who were out of Russian control, and they were taken to special premises for torturing. And in Kherson, the people found those premises for torturing children. And the two teenagers, 16-year-olds, refused to get education according to Russian program because they believe that the armed forces of Ukraine would come to the temporary occupied territories and rescue them and save them. And the occupying forces came to those two children, and they were torturing them, and we couldn't manage to save those children because their parents are living in the temporarily occupied territories, and they are refusing to evacuate and to go to other territories. And it is very hard, extremely hard to rescue young Ukrainian boys, because Russians perceive them as future military men, and they are trained for military purposes. Also, the children on the occupied territories are brainwashed. They are taught distorted Russian history, so they would refuse Ukrainian citizenship, and they will accept Russian citizenship in order to pass exams and so on. There are also different proofs from Ukrainian parents who are forced to accept Russian passports, or otherwise their children would be tortured and deported. And talking about our case about two girls, they were transferred under the disclosure of the resort in Crimea. Many people believe that it is it is responsibility of girls because they accepted that suggestion. But if you are kept for 2 weeks if you are kept in a sanatorium, if your cultural identity is ruined, it is the violation of law. The documents of those children who were transferred were also falsified. And Russians suddenly recalled about the laws when Ukraine started to save and return those children. The first thing that Russians do in the occupied territories is the elimination of Ukrainian identity. Russians are forcing Ukrainian children to love Russia, to sing patriotic songs, and if someone denies this strategy, so Ukrainians are denying this strategy, those people would be tortured. And I met a 16-year-old girl who said that her friend and she were abducted, kidnapped by Russians on the street, and they were kept in premises in a prison. They were imprisoned for some days without food and water, and they were prosecuted. They were asked about Ukrainian armed forces, and they had no information, but still they were kept in prison. A boy near the village of Broad was executed when occupiers came to that village. The boy was feared, and he started to run away, but he was fired. Teenagers from Snehurivka. The teenager from Snehurivka was beaten and taken away during the retreat of Russian army from Snehurivka in Kherson region. And there are a lot of such cases, and the situation will remain the same if the world isn't isn't responding and isn't demanding Russians to take away its army from Ukrainian territories, and they will continue to torture and beat our children. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Yulia. You were speaking about those crimes, and recently the boy who was the boy whom we tried to return was beaten, and he was forced to take off his clothes. He was forced to put away all the things from his bag. He was naked, and he had to take all the things from his bag and show it on the video camera. Another case, a mother who came to her child, and the child was patriotic, and that mother and her son were forced to take off their clothes and to express gratitude to the Russian Federation on camera, and they were the mother and child were blackmailed about the publishing of that video if they say anything bad about Russia. And there are a lot of cases of torturing, a lot of cases of humiliation. When for example, mother is kidnapped, is taken away with her eyes closed, and that mother is forced to declaim, to cite the written text on camera about, for example, that Save Ukraine sent her. Because according to Russian media, when Save Ukraine actually do rescue operations, it is perceived as the abduction of children from the territories of Russia. Save for Ukrainians, it is the return of Ukrainian children, but for Russia, in case of Russian propaganda, it is presented as the abduction of children by us. So it is important to talk about this because it is part of information war, it is part of propaganda. And I would like to give the floor to Mr. Yulian Ulybin to talk about the importance of culture in this war.
Good afternoon. Unfortunately, I will not be able to talk about this comprehensively because since the beginning of the war, I was inside this war. My space was armed hostilities, and my space is the everyday terrorism against my state. And I'd like to show a trailer, 5-minute trailer, which is part of my report, but you will understand about which terrorism we are talking about against Ukraine from Russia. This is serious children of
З цією школою мене пов'язує
Що ти знаєш про війну? Про те, як діти сплять в бомбосховищі. Ти бачиш війну? А зараз моїми очима. І я не один, таких як я мільйони. Багатьом вдалося втекти, але ще більше людей потрапили в пастку.
Хлеб наш насущный, дай нам на сей день, и прости нам грехи наши, как мы прощаем должникам нашим, и не введи нас в искушение, избавь нас от лукавого, во имя Отца и Сына и Святого Духа. Аминь.
Как ты думаешь, молитва защитила тебя?
Да.
Він у мене боєць.
І він, коли ми виїжджав з абсолютною впевненістю, що він один може знищити 200 російських танків.
Коли літає літак російський, треба отак падати. А я думав, що це бахнуло. Ну, очень страшно в Миколаеве сейчас.
Виходили жінки, їх обшукували, в тому числі і мене, везде, навіть там.
Це гроза?
Нет, это не гроза.
Если я где-то возле погреба нахожусь, то мне легче быстренько в погреб спуститься. А если на улице, что делать? Падать. Голову закрыла, рот открыла и жди.
Третього розстріляли, цього розстріляли. Тут снаряд розорвало снарядом, розстріляли.
Просто і все.
Виключно були цивільні люди, жінки, старіки, діти. Все.
Дивимося там. Театру нема.
Розумієте, да? Є дві сторони. Є війна. І ми відстоюємо нашу сторону українську, а ви є свідки.
Нові для нас слова. Прильот і ответка. Так. Нещодавно прилетіло в будинок поряд з нами. Він стояв обгорілий, чорний.
Гради, вони як пух-пух-пух-пух, отак один за одним.
Я вже не помню. Я вже не помню. Я вже не помню. Це вже давно було.
Світ дуже великий, но ніхто не знайде второго Маріуполя в этой жизни. Ніхто.
Я пряталась в підвалі.
В принципі, найгірше, що зараз може бути в житті, в світі, це народитися росіянином. Особливо, якщо ти адекватна людина.
Страшно. Холодно.
Ти їдеш по своїй землі з білим флагом, з білою порваною футболкою, держиш в руках ту футболку, наклейка «Діти». Ну, просто единственная мечта, чтобы с детьми пойти где-то погулять в парке, как мы раньше это делали.
Такой самый ответ, куда ехать? С кучей детей, менять обстановки вечно. А вдруг на Западе тоже начнется война, потом куда? Тоже бежать куда-то? Не хочу я пока.
Ти можеш згадати самий хороший момент?
Саме хороший – це коли я перший раз за місяць чистила зуби і дивилася, як горить Урал російський. Це взагалі я сиділа. Мені було все одно на ті прильоти, я не знаю, їх слава Богу тоді не було. Але зашкалювали емоції. Дуже приємно було дивитися.
Мені хочеться тобі розказати про наших дітей. Адже чужих дітей не буває. І всі ми родом з дитинства, всі наші страхи зароджуються саме тоді, коли ми пізнаємо світ. Що ти знаєш про війну?
So, this is what the war is like for us, and I'd like to tell you about some particular stories from this war, so that you can understand the scale of it, and understand that we are not waging war with a state which is only using military means, but also we are waging war against terrorists who taken our children as hostages, and which we will have to return in the future. Because with terrorists, nobody conducts any negotiations, and I cannot imagine a civilized country which would have negotiations with ones who take hostages. Imagine that there is a bomb shelter in a school, and there are 73 children aged from 7 to 14, and they are spending 28 days underground. 11 people were shot because they were not agreed. 11 more died of suffocating because they were in this closed space and of being old, in elderly age, and they just lost their minds. So imagine a story of a woman who is living occupied territory, and a tank bullet is aiming her car, kills her husband. He jumps out of her car and sees her daughter without a head. Blood is pulsing from the neck. She jumps into the forest and is hiding there, and then Russians find her. And what do you think? What did Russians say the first when they entered this club where she was hiding? They said, "Everything will be okay, we came here to rescue you." She wasn't held, she wasn't taken into the hospital, she wasn't given any aid, and together with a 1-year-old child, he went back to the basement of that same school, where she was there for 28 days as well, and were tortured together with other people. And you have to understand why I'm talking about this. Russians use our children as a live shield. When there were shellings, they were taking children outside so that Ukrainian forces stopped this shelling because of the human shield, and the Russians just were saving their lives by covering with our children. It's only one of the thousands of stories which is documented, and I think that it has to be one of the first to take court trial against Putin, because violence against our children is just very high, and there are many stories of this. And for example, if we take excursion to northern Saltivka in Kharkiv, and I think that such stories and films must be showed to everyone. So going back to Saltivka, northern Saltivka, there is no educational institution which is not damaged. You cannot even imagine what is it like to go through a school which been targeted by S-300 system for 4 times. In the school there is a basement, but it's not a bomb shelter, and we cannot even imagine how many people stuck there underground are there, and it will take many years to rescue them, to find those bodies underground. And to talk about these actions of Russian against our children, you have to understand that Mykolaiv was shelled by artillery because they had this opportunity, because they were very close to the city. And imagine a situation when a mother with 2 children has a direct shot into her house, and he cannot leave Mykolaiv because, first of all, she has no place to go, and she has a mother who is disabled and cannot be transported. So she comes with 2 children to her work and goes to work in a hotel. We saw this, and when we came to the hotel, we understand that this woman was given an opportunity to live in that hotel with her two children. And then we're shelling. We came to the basement, and I observed the reaction of the children. And I, who was at the front lines, I felt frightened. But those children in this basement, they weren't frightened at all. They used to it. And they have a broken perception of the world and psychological consequences. And I, as a person who saw all this, I can characterize this that our future generation is traumatized. It is broken. And I don't even know what we have to do with this and how much time will it take. And talking about the situation of conducting this war, we were talking with many children. Through my eyes there were hundreds, I won't say 1,000, maybe a couple of hundreds of children, and they, inside of them, have fear. They are afraid of their future, and they don't know how to plan it. And I think that the most important problem is to understand how we can deal with this and help them return back to normal life. Because if a child has no reaction to explosions, to siren, and to shellings, just imagine that in 20 years she will have no social norms and psychological as well, because she is a child of war. Talking about how we have to deal with this, because Europe doesn't want to watch our content right now, and I faced it on my own experience. Nobody watches this, because in Telegram there are constantly dead bodies, and people cannot perceive more information from Ukraine. This is unfortunately truth, and I think that we have to develop such content which can be watched by all peoples without corpse. This just has to be a detailed explanation of a problem, but it has to be done daily, and we have to cooperate with all foreign missions. For example, we have a nice example of cooperation with Portugal, where we show this serious children of bomb shelters, and with a voluntary organization, they gathered a huge humanitarian assistance, and those aid was headed to Kherson region. And if we are given this information very clearly, then we will have a better response. I don't know when this war will end, but I know that we will win in any case. But the question of how we will return children back to normal lives, first of all, it's not my competence, but I am radicalist. I'd like to create a body like Mossad, so that we can return our children by any price. That we know that in Russia there is our child, and we have to return it back to Ukraine. I don't know how to have negotiations with terrorists, for example. Thank you very much, Julian. Your series is a very good example. And it shows that Russian are killers. They are killing our children, and they have nothing holy in their souls. We cannot have negotiations with them. They are manipulating, conducting fraudulence, and their only aim is to destroy Ukraine, to destroy our identity, and this trauma of the war cannot be fully understood by us, because the war is still going on, but we see the children and we see the consequences of those traumas. And now I'd like Mr. Sergei, as a person who sees people who were victims of this war every day and who have not only problems with physical health but also with psychological health. What can you say as a representative of our medical system, of a national institution, Ahmadi Children's Hospital? What challenges do you face every day and what consequences can it have?
Thank you, Mr. Mykola Kuleba. Good afternoon to all. Really, the medical dimension of the war is has many layers in it. The first, the most visible one is, of course, the children who died or who were wounded, and unfortunately, with every day passing, there are more and more such children because Russia assaults its strikes on civilian objects, and there's no tendency to reduce the amount of those strikes. And every day we hear news about that civilians were killed, and almost 500 were killed, and almost 1,000 children were injured, according to our estimates. But we all know that this estimate is much higher because we have no access to many data, and we cannot really comprehend the scale of the tragedies in the occupied territories of Ukraine. It is the most visible, the clearest part, the clearest aspect, and the number of victims on the territory which is not occupied is the estimates there are easy to find out. With the start of the full-scale invasion, the hospitals, including Avri Hospital, who were located in the territories of hostilities, had to evacuate hundreds of thousands of patients who were in need of further treatment. Of course, it had the negative impact on the treatment, on the development of illness, and many patients were cut off their treatment, and they had no opportunity to get the adequate medical treatment. And the most vulnerable category is, of course, people with oncology, people with cancer, because, of course, those patients need a lot of treatment, and people in intensive therapy can hardly be transferred. And of course, it is hard to find the hospitals that can give the quotas for those patients, and it is hard to find out the actual number of people who became victims because their treatment could not develop, could not continue as usual. The second issue is that the children who are on the occupied territories, who are on the newly occupied territories, we can see that they had no access to the first aid and to the treatment on early stages of their illness. As we can see, it is if those children get their treatment earlier and on time, their illnesses could be treated more easy. And this problem will continue, unfortunately, and we could see the outcomes in the overall health rate of Ukrainians. It is also kind of clear aspect, and those physical illnesses are more easy to diagnose, as otherwise the vice versa with the mental health and mental issues. And unfortunately, no country, no civilized country had such an experience in last decades of this mass psychological trauma of the whole generation. And the outcomes of this trauma would be visible in many decades coming. And we haven't even faced the real problems that are grounded on this psychological trauma. And in many years, in the next years, after analyzing the rate of suicides, rate of depression diagnosis, and analyzing those issues, we will talk about the basics, the basis of those problems, the war. And of course, the medical assistance, medical help is in their need. People are in their need of medical assistance, and there are a lot of internationals who are coming to Ukraine to learn experience and to provide their assistance, to provide their help. But we also should understand that spending €1 for help in Ukraine, you also save thousands of euros in your country, because thanks to that €1, your country wouldn't have to accept Ukrainians for further treatment and for medical for medical purposes. Another issue is that the health system as a part of Russian warfare, as it is the part of the instrument, a tool for gathering information, gathering all the lists from hospitals, and use those lists for their own purposes. And also another issue is that the use of healthcare as for example, as the guise of the evacuation, so-called evacuation of Ukrainian children when they are taken away from Ukrainian territories to Russians, and Ukrainian children there are tortured and they're suffering. So it is I don't know how to deal with my so-called Russian colleagues. I don't know whether I can even call them colleagues with Russian citizenships, because they are not uneducated Russian soldiers who are full of alcohol, but those Russian doctors, Russian healthcare workers, they are educated and they know the consequences of their actions. And I think that those consequences, the crimes committed by those healthcare workers are more severe, because they know what they're doing. And the reaction of international community, different medical associations, is unfortunately not unanimous. in their evaluation of the actions of Russian healthcare workers. So there are a lot of organizations that are still not excluded Russia from their list, and they are still inviting Russians to their conferences, to their meetings, and they give the floor to Russians. What else should happen? What more crimes should Russia commit so our European and not only European but international colleagues could understand that the Russia must be isolated from the civilized world if we want to have a future. And by we, I mean not only Ukraine but the community of civilized countries, and I call upon all our partners to remain helping you, to continue helping Ukraine. It is the 1.5 year war is not a reason to be tired of war, because it is not only Ukrainian war, it is the civilized countries' war. And I had an opportunity to visit the United States last year, and I communicated with many colleagues there, and I was emphasizing that the possible defeat of Ukraine is not the defeat of Ukraine, but the defeat of the whole world, because Russia would not cease its actions, but all the bad guys, the so-called bad guys, would find out that it is possible, because the world would do nothing, and those bad guys would start anything. I don't want to name those countries, but I think you all know what states I'm referring to. So the world has to prevent the possibility of Ukrainian defeat, because it will be a tragedy for all, a catastrophe for all. Thank you. I would also like to add something to Mr. Chernishuk's words from the point of view of law. I think you all remember that after the World War II, the Nuremberg Tribunal also included the court, the prosecution of healthcare workers, and I think that we would experience the same nowadays after this war, because I think that the role of medical workers are important. We all know that the so-called initiative of Dr. Lisa before the full-scale invasion, who was abducting the thousands of Ukrainian children from the occupied territories of Ukraine in the east of Ukraine. Also, I would like to refer to the hospital of Roshals near Moscow, because it is the point where Ukrainian children are brought to, and then they are transferred to other hospitals and other cities. And those children who are in that hospital near Moscow, there are people with disabilities, and of course, and they are not prioritized by Russian families for adoption. So people. So, for example, people who were eager to adopt a Russian child, they were actually forced to adopt a Ukrainian child from the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. So when we see, for example, the difference in numbers announced by Lvova Belova, we can assume that those children are returned or they are adopted. Also, there's the dispensation, the hospitalization. It is a policy introduced last year, but it is actually not a bad policy overall, but in our case, 75 children in Donetsk region, in the occupied territories. They needed to be hospitalized. So that hospitalization is also a part of Russian policy, because those 75 children were absolutely healthy, were in stable condition in Ukraine, but they were in need for hospitalization under Russian occupation forces. Another concept, the medical and psychological rehabilitation. There are so-called the camps for re-education. And Ukrainian children are taken not only to Russian Federation and occupied territories, but also to the territories of the Republic of Belarus, near Soligorsk and Minsk, and we have no information whether those children are returned, because there's no official list of those children, and the International Committee of Red Cross also has no information about the identification of those children. And there are a lot of other cases, but concluding, I would like to find notice on Kornienko to Pushilin that the hospitals on the territory of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic are overloaded with children, and all those children had no need for hospitalization, but that information. But there is information that that the people are hospitalized in so-called Donetsk People's Republic, and they are those hospitals are overloaded, so they have to be transferred somewhere else.
Thank you, Ms. Kateryna. And there are any doubts that in such crazy minds of our aggressor, they can do anything they want, like transportologists, the trafficking of organs, and so on. So therefore, we crucially need support from our international partners and international organizations, to which we are constantly making questions, so that we can receive information upon every child. Where is she now? What is her condition? And how can we return her back? And before the discussion, I'd like to show you a short video, because our organization Save Ukraine is conducting rescue missions where we save families and children from areas of hostilities, where we cure traumas and conduct programs on reintegration of those families into our communities. But we will now talk about people who are abducted, and here is the video.
Как проходили дни в Крыму? Ты должен петь русский гимн, стоять вместе со всеми. Если не поешь, пишешь объяснительно. Если не будешь объяснительную писать, буду с тобой по-другому общаться. Если ты не слушаешься вожатых и с тобой ничего не могут сделать, проезжает начальник лагеря, начальник смены, начальник по безопасности, и тебя ложат в изолятор. Изолятор — это комната, 3 на 3, будем грубо говорить. На улицу ты не выходишь. У меня была ситуация, я пробовал 5 дней в изоляторе. Делайте, что хотите, но я не буду в изоляторе один лежать. Они говорят, надо потерпеть. Я говорю, терпеть я не буду, это не для меня. Надо что-то делать. И в итоге врач говорит, я сейчас тебе дам таблеты, мы вызовем скорую, и тебя увезут. Я говорю, куда? Она говорит, в психушку. Ну, тут я уже чуть-чуть заволновался, успокоился, пошел умылся, ну и пришел в себя. Телефон забрали на проверку. И военный комиссар приехал, говорит, собирайся. Я говорю, куда? Он говорит, ну, надо поехать пообщаться. Я, долго не думая, обулся, оделся. Ну, что-то мы с ним едем, сзади автомат лежит. Ну, приезжаем в какой-то дом. Он говорит, выходи. Я говорю, заходи в дом, сейчас я подойду. Ну, я слышу, что там военные уже какие-то ходят. Кто-то кричит там. Ну, я зашел в дом, смотрю, там темнота, лампочка горит одна какая-то, старая, в пыли вся. Ситуация, он заходит с автоматом, говорит, что-то еще будешь писать на ту сторону, будем уже по-другому общаться. Все, если ты меня понял, телефон почистишь. И все, и он отвез меня обратно. Сказал, украинского вообще ничего не говорит. Никому номера все украинские тоже поудаляют. Все фотки, связанные с Украиной. И на украинском тоже не общаться.
Це яскраве свідчення того, що відбувається з
This is a bright example of what is happening to the children who are living at occupied territories, how they are frightened, how they are threatened, and how their life is in danger. And I would like to give the floor to Ivan Bech, Institute of Education of National Academy of Pedagogical Sciences of Ukraine, and Alexander Musayenko, head of the Center of Civil and War Studies. Both of them are in Zoom conference, so you're welcome. Greetings. I will start. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity and for giving floor. I am very grateful for the discussion that we had here, and I think that it is very important, and I express my gratitude to every speaker and to organizers for paying attention to this problem, because there will never be too many time for enlightening this topic. And recently I published research of Russian and Putin's genocide against Ukrainian people, where I studied this destruction of identity, because it was particularly held upon the destruction of identity. And I'd like to refer to a speech of Putin when last year he said, referring to Peter I, Russian Tsar, and their expansionist policies and their practice of occupying other peoples and destroying their identities, how and which horizons they are measuring the world. And this is not only modern world that people in the West think that we can just fix it. This was this had been held for a very long time. In 2021, Putin wrote an article where he said that Ukrainian people doesn't exist, that Russians and Ukrainians are actually one people. And talking about genocide, about the term, that the aim of Soviet power was external expansion, during which they had to destroy Ukrainian people and to destroy their identity. And the aim of that was external expansion. And Western partners have to remember this, because Russian war against Ukraine, it not just trying to prevent Ukraine from entering NATO and the EU. The primary aim is expansion, and the obstacle for this expansion is Ukrainian people. And in order to take away this obstacle, they want to destroy Ukrainian people and to destroy Ukrainian children as well, by bringing them to Russia, by brainwashing them and recruiting to Russian army, so that they are an army of conquerors in the new renewed Russian Empire and go further to Baltic countries, to Poland, Czechia, and further into Europe. This is their aim. It has not been mentioned once, and historical experience shows this. And in Ukrainian soil there were many resurrections of national dignity when they were trying to take freedom. And this continues now, and they are trying to take away this gene of freedom and to take away our values of freedom, which are understandable to European civilization. And when our partners are talking about the universal values, on the way of this, on parts of these values, there has to be no Putin's power. There has to be no Russian propagandist machine, because the informational policy is a fully genocidal policy, and this was mentioned. People who are educated and actually have to understand something, they take part in this propaganda, and they are doing this deliberately and deliberately fueling this violation. And I am very thankful to Save Ukraine and to other organizations who are working on different areas. And now Ukraine has to win, and this will be a rightful solution, and will be rightful, of course, not only to Ukraine but also to the Western partners, because Ukraine is now defending Europe. Because if Ukrainian people fall, they will go further. Thank you for your attention and for the possibility to...
Thank you so much, Mr. Moiseyenko. And while you were talking and I was listening, I recall different philosophers and different researchers, and I understand that it is clear that our independence is still young. We are only 30 years old, but the enemy clearly comprehends that if our children are capable of upbringing with Ukrainian identity, if Ukrainian children, Ukrainian young generation is capable of becoming a new generation of Ukrainians, it is the annihilation of Russia's plans to destroy Ukraine, to destroy Ukrainian identity, and and Ukraine to become part of Russia. And if Mr. Ivan Bech is in the Zoom conference, I would like to give you a floor. Excuse me, I would like to give a speech on the behalf of the Institute of Education of the National Academy of Pedagogical Science. Sorry that I do not have video. It is awful to understand how many children became victims of Russian aggression, and those numbers are not final. And Ukraine will fight the fight is continuing on different levels, and our children are experiencing awful things, and it is important to consolidate all the efforts on different strategical directions in healthcare, in education, and of course the return of Ukrainian children and rehabilitation from the distortion of reality from Russian propaganda, because our children are on the are part of information warfare, and it is important to underline the youth Ukrainian organizations who are the allies of Ukraine and who proved to be important in the educating Ukrainian youth, and the world values like freedom, like human rights and so on, they are the is a very underpinning of Ukrainian nation, and of course international organizations should be participant of different operations and should be part of the settlement of those different conflicts. And of course the Institute of Education is eager to contribute to the resolving of issues and to contribute all the resources aimed at the welfare of Ukrainian society. If you need us, if we could be helpful in any aspect, we would be happy to join the important initiatives on this regard. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, and
Serhiy Rashevsky, writer, diplomat, expert of Center for Russian Studies. In order for you to understand, I had in the Foreign Ministry I was responsible for Latin America and Russia. First of all, this night there was information from Reuters with a link to Karazin, member of Russian Parliament, and he was conducting negotiations upon Russian fleet in Ukraine, and he named the number 700,000 of people, of children. And this is the last number, and we can talk about, take this number into account. And as well, in the reports to our international partners and organizations, you know that they call this evacuation, that we will have their own point of view, and they will be opponents to this. But at least this number, we have this number. This is my first remark. And after a few scandals with Credobank, upon the compensation to the victims of Nazism, the thing is that in the West, in Western Europe, those countries where there was sphere of responsibility of Federal German Republic, not People's German Republic, those questions were raised from the end of the 40s and early 50s. And these countries, the Netherlands, Denmark, we were trying to ask them and to receive the laws. So those countries, they were developing laws upon victims of Nazism. And I think that here in Ukraine, talking about children and different categories of children who were victims of Russian aggression, victims of this war. And the last thing, a couple of years ago, Me, as a literary translator, I was translating from Spanish to Spanish. I was translating a book of a representative of UNICEF, Álvaro Vadinho, and the book was called Children of Babylon. These are children. This is a book about children in extreme situations in different countries which he visited. And there was a first caption. It wasn't in Spanish edition, but it was in Ukrainian edition. This UNICEF representative worked in Mariupol, and he visited occupied territories as a representative of UNICEF. Currently he is in other country, but I'd like to say that on the basis of his book we can talk about some parallels in order to explain to our foreign partners through the history of their countries. All this book, Children of Babylon, describes children in different extreme situations. Often they are children in the conditions of war, and as well as children, kamikaze children, when they are blowing up themselves and a military object. There are different plots in that book. And here, talking about countries of Latin America, it happens there, and as well as Palestine. There are such parallels. And the question is very simple. We were talking about International Red Cross Committee, but what about UNICEF? Do we cooperate with them? I will answer on the question concerning UNICEF on my professional work. Concerning UNICEF Ukraine, they chose a simple way. They work on issues which concern children under controlled Ukrainian territories, so that we don't have the right to criticize their activities. But talking about the occupied territories and forcibly deported children, they say that they don't have access to them. What concerning Belarus, I asked them about children in Belarus, not politicized, very friendly, just to know what conditions are there for our children in Belarus, and UNICEF Belarus didn't give any response to me. And concerning UNICEF and the Russian Federation territory, UNICEF Russia takes care about people on the territory of Russian Federation, and for them occupied territories of Ukraine do not exist. They are non-political, and they just do their work on the territory of Russian Federation. I don't know if to criticize them. They are doing just what they are doing, but they are not doing enough. They could have taken care upon the children who are under effective control of Russian Federation. And I'd like for us to understand that there is not question of criticism. This is an issue then when your children are killed, you are shouting to the whole world, and from that organizations who were talking about their mandates, who have this mandate and have their legislation and should have represented those children in armed conflicts, so that they could at least perform their functions. But if they can't do this, they also must shout that we are not allowed to do this, so that they could give facts that they are not allowed to conduct their work. Because if they are silent, they are also guilty of that. For example, when Mariia Lvova says that there are 700,000 children registered and that she won't provide this information to Ukraine, so at least we want to hear the powerful voice of powerful organizations such as International Red Cross Committee, UNICEF, and other organizations as the UN concerning their lawful estimate of these actions and their reactions in response to these speeches. And this is our resentment, not just criticism. We would like to hear this powerful voice in protection of our children. So that is what it looks like. And I'd like to add very quickly, do you remember I was talking about baby steps diplomacy? And concerning UNICEF, particular actions that UNICEF can conduct is to say that it doesn't depend on how long Ukrainian children be in Russian families, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years. This is not in accordance with their interests, and that children will be anyway returned to Ukraine, because upon existing standards, international standards, in a couple of years Russia can leave those children in Russia, and this will be a continuation of genocide. This is what can we do without having access to occupied territories. And another thing, we have evidence of speaking with children who live with their parents at the territory of Russian Federation, aged 15, 16, 17, who don't want to live at the territory of Russian Federation, who are frightened and who were forced to get Russian passports, but they want to return to Ukraine. And do they at least have the right to talk about their rights at the territory of the enemy? Of course they do not have it, and therefore we ask you to hear their voice. We know that there are many such children of them who cannot just accept the situation, and they don't want to accept this enemy's reality. But someone has to help them and to protect them. And you're welcome as well.
Thank you. Igor Turyansky, former ambassador of Ukraine to Turkey and the South African Republic. Ukrainian legislation lacks the term of the former ambassador, so I am ambassador. And
уряду за щасливе дитинство. Потім ми говорили спасибі дорогому Микиті Сергійовичу, а потім Леоніду Іллічу. У той же час моральні устої, які закладалися дитині, батьками, дитячим садком, школою, вони не у всіх залишалися в пам'яті, але у багатьох вони залишалися в пам'яті. У мене залишилося в пам'яті те, що батьки говорили про тих людей, які жили на нашій вулиці у рідному Корсунь-Шевченківському Черкаської області. Оця людина не має ні сорому, ні совісті. А ця людина, вона позитивна. І коли хтось щось хотів сказати чи зробити, то у нього було таке моральне гальмо. А що скажуть люди? На превеликий жаль, сьогодні у Російській Федерації отаких гальм немає. І перша тема для сьогоднішнього обговорення говорить про те, як Росія порушує принципи міжнародного права, залучаючи молодь, підлітків до військової служби. У 1983 році, будучи працівником постійного представництва Української Радянської Соціалістичної Республіки у Сполучених Штатах, у Нью-Йорку, я почув такий вислів сенатора Сполучених Штатів, майбутнього віце-президента Сполучених Штатів Дона Куейла, який сказав, що Радянський Союз на той час і міжнародне право – це несумісні поняття. У 2016 році, будучи активним учасником українського відділення Асоціації міжнародного права і штаб-квартирою в Лондоні, я брав участь у одному із засідань цієї організації, і професор міжнародного права Філадельфійського університету навів такий приклад, що в нього була аспірантка, американка українського походження, яка писала дисертацію на тему «Радянський Союз і міжнародне право». Висновок був такий, що для Радянського Союзу і вже для Росії, оскільки це був 2016 рік, немає такого поняття, як міжнародного права. Коли ви читаєте документи засадничі Міністерства закордонних справ Російської Федерації або Росії, ви бачите, наскільки відрізняються слова від дій. Тому що вони говорять одне, Росія говорить одне, а робить абсолютно інше. І звертаючись сьогодні до учасників сьогоднішнього круглого столу, до спікерів, я хочу сказати, щоб вони пам'ятали про те, що не тільки сьогоднішня, минула і сьогоднішня, і майбутня поведінка до того часу, поки Російська Федерація буде існувати, це поведінка спруту, який своїми щупальцями намагається охопити весь світ. І як ще передбачав наш великий пророк Тарас Григорович Шевченко, щоб загарбать і з собою взять у домовину. Лозунг «Діти – наше майбутнє», вона сьогодні використовується надзвичайно активно Російською Федерацією. Це мілітаристське майбутнє. Вони готують майбутніх солдат, майбутнє гарматне м'ясо, майбутніх людей, які покладуть своє життя для міфічної величі російського міра у цьому світі. Спасибі вам і хай вам щастить у вашій повсякденній діяльності.
Дякую вам.
Thank you all the participants who joined the discussion, and please, I could see three upraised hands. The first, firstly, I am very grateful for your experience, for your work. I'm Natalia Glenska, and I am the case manager of the Magnolia Ukrainian organization for the search of children, and we are doing our activities for many years, and we did not cease our activities since the full-scale invasion of Russia. There are a lot of requests to us about the deportation of Ukrainian children, about the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to the territory of the Russian Federation and temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and we give the information about the information we get to save Ukraine, and we have information about the missing children. We have the information about the children who are considered missing from the territory, from the people of the Russian Federation and the temporarily occupied territories, because those people are seen there. And I would like to suggest to consolidate our efforts and cooperate in order to achieve better results. It is great, and I know Magnolia for their activities. And we would like to cooperate with you. Good afternoon. Firstly, I would like to express gratitude to the speakers and participants for your great contributions in researching this issue and in preventing the deportation of Ukraine. I am Danilo Havrilov, and we are researching the modern deportation of Ukrainians, as well as research the historical grounds of this process. And as Mykola Kuleba mentioned, it is not the first time deportation, as we experienced it in Soviet times when Ukrainians were transferred. More than 200,000 Ukrainians were became victims of deportation in the 1930s and 40s. and also other countries in Soviet Union became victims of deportation. For example, the countries like Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and our colleagues from there are recalling children who were abroad in the under the circumstances of deportation, and those children had problems with learning English, with their self-identification. They weren't able. Their parents could be prosecuted for national for singing national songs and so on. And I would like to add about the modern deportations, as Ms. Rashevska noted that Mariia Belova is not the only way, the only person who is guilty, but also many other people, and those people have to be sanctioned and have to be prosecuted. So my question is maybe addressed to Mykola Kuleba. In your opinion, the process of returning of Ukrainian children, this process has to be long-term, short-term, or how dangerous, how threatening is the scale and the terms of living of Ukrainian children in deportation, because it will be hard for them to return, because those Ukrainian children will be granted Russian citizenship, they will be abroad in Russia and so on. It is a very important issue, and one example, recently the Poles issued the certificates of birth to 73-year-old Germans who were never, who didn't even know that they were Poles, because they were forcibly transferred during the World War II. And just imagine how much effort should we put to return the consciousness, the minds of those children who are living in the occupied territories of Ukraine, to return those children who are currently in Russia. I am communicating, I am in contact, in touch with these children, and another representative of Save Ukraine is on daily contact with those children, and those children who were ready to come back to Ukraine a month ago. There are obstacles for them to come back, because they are brainwashed, because they are perceived that the so-called Nazis in Ukraine would kill them. Those Ukrainians were suggested to be granted the ID of orphan and have privileges and have, for example, the accommodation. It is a policy of the Russian Federation of assimilation of Ukrainian children. It is what happening there, and therefore we are obliged to return them. And you mentioned the law of on children who became victims of the Russian Federation of Russianism. We should think about that, and not just in the way that with the mottos like "Children of a Future," but we should plan the exact steps on how to help them, how to return them, we can't yet imagine the problems we will face in the occupied, the liberated territories of Ukraine, and we should be ready for the many years of work to build our nation, to strengthen our nation, and to work with our children who were under the control of Russians in the temporary occupied territories. And the third question.
Thank you for this event. I am representative of international judicial company, to which more than 1,000 of different experts from the world joined. We issued a civil case against Prigozhin Wagner company, and we want to take back those $20 billion which were in assets of Wagner, and to distribute them among people who were victims of Russian aggression. And as a citizen of Ukraine, I'm trying to convey this information, and upon other topics except for Wagner Group, also on the topic of ecocide, upon the torture of civil persons and deportation of children. And I can't talk about many those things, and I'd like to talk to you personally. And in order to, I have information how we can relate and connect this information with our partners abroad, and we would like to make this happen, to take Wagner Group's money and help them, to those children who you will return to Ukraine, and maybe to help them financially. The second topic is I am a co-founder of charitable fund Mama Jane, and we are doing psychological rehabilitation for children who were returned from the occupied territories to Germany. Our next trip will be held in September, and if we have the opportunity to talk about this topic, we would like to help those children which will be returned in the nearest time to Ukraine. And we would like to cooperate with you, for example, or other organizations that usually cooperate with the same name organization, Save Ukraine in France, represented by Ukrainians. And we will conduct those 2-week camps, rehabilitation camps in Spain, Germany, France, United Kingdom. So I'd like to talk with you after the events. Yeah, thank you. We will talk about this later. And at the conclusion, I'd like to thank all the participants, all the speakers who joined us here, who joined us online. I'd like to thank the Director General of Foreign Services to Diplomatic Missions, State, and as well as Pavlo Krivonos, the Director General. We would like to continue our discussion and our contacts. We will present our work, and we will talk about what the aggressor does to our children and what we have to do in order to prevent this. Thank you so much.